Welcome everybody to this afternoon's session. My name is Jane Barnes. I'm on the board of Homelessness Australia and I work with Wintringham down in Victoria and Tasmania. Just make sure you're all in the right session. This is the Housing First and now for the hard part. So we start by acknowledging traditional custodians of the lands that we're gathering on, both here in Canberra and the various lands around the country of those who are joining us online. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and also say a big welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people who may be attending either here in person or online. This session has been sponsored by Bridge Housing, and we were very much looking forward to Rebecca Pinkstone, who is the CEO of Bridge Housing, being up here with us today on the panel. But unfortunately, Beck has succumbed to illness and is unable to join us. So then there were four. We wish you a very speedy recovery, Beck, and we do thank your organisation for the sponsorship. We are being recorded online today, and we will be taking questions from online as well as from the audience. Can I please say, if you've got a question, and even if I engage with you, I will look at you, I'll probably then say, can you hold it until you get a microphone? Because it's impossible for people who are online to hear what the question is. And as someone who's got some ageing hearing issues, I don't think I'd be able to hear you either. So there will be people wandering with mics. Please wait for that microphone and we'll make sure you get your question answered because we hear it. Can I just say that, what else am I going to say? Here we go. Use the Delegate app. I'm reading my housekeeping instructions. Most of you have heard it all by now, so it really doesn't matter if I sort of stuff it up a little bit. But I think I've done everything I need to do. Right, let's get started. Housing first, a bit of a theme at the moment, isn't it? And it's not a new theme to, I'm sure, most people in this room. It has now been successfully adopted and implemented in a number of countries across the world, including here in Australia. The model, of course, prioritised the provision of long-term housing and individualised support to people experiencing homelessness without any preconditions or barriers. It finally disposes with the notion that people need to be housing ready before they can be housed. Across Australia, we have a number of Housing First programs operating. Few of them are long-term, like the Common Ground program, but an awful lot of them are still in the pilot stage. And whilst evaluations that have been conducted on these programs consistently report high levels of tenancy sustainment and cost savings and cost offsets to government, there has been a reluctance to commit. So what we are hoping for is that as we start this conversation today, we really start to look to persuade governments across the country in the investment, not only just in the housing stock. And look, I have to say, and I just said it to my fellow panel members, we've been around and arguing the need for housing for an awfully long time, you know, and I think Shane certainly put it this morning, we've got a long way to go. But I think it's really important that as we get recognition that housing, social housing is a priority, we don't lose track of the fact that we need the support. We need to keep the conversation not just about housing, but about support as well. So, with everybody now talking about Housing First, what does it mean? Is everything that's being funded Housing First? How do we manage the challenge of implementing Housing First with sufficient fidelity to those key ingredients underpinning its success? So to help us grapple with these questions, we have brought together a highly experienced panel of speakers, and we also recognise that there's quite a bit of experience in the audience as well. Our first panellist today will be Beth Fogerty. Beth's the Senior Manager with Wellways Australia and has been involved for a while now in the International Housing First Consortium, and Beth's going to speak to us about why it might be important to develop a universal definition of housing first. Coming after Beth will be Michala McMahon. Michala is the Director of Practice and Improvement for the Western Australian Alliance to End Homelessness. And Michala is going to speak to us about her experiences in the UK and what they talk about as being the non-negotiables of housing first. After Beck, Beck's not here, sorry, this is my notes. After Michala will be Cathy Humphrey. Cathy is the CEO of Sacred Heart Mission in Victoria, and she's going to talk to us about delivering housing first without a guaranteed supply of social housing. And finally today, we are very lucky to be joined with Karyn Walsh, the CEO of Micah Projects, who's going to share her observations of the broader application of housing first, both here in Australia and overseas. We would like this to be as interactive as possible. So what we agreed to do when we got together ahead of the conference was have a planned question from me to start the conversation, and people can give you a sense of their experiences and what they're going to be focusing on. But then we really want to start a conversation. All right. So there will be a planned question from each in response, and then hopefully we'll flow into a bit more of a conversation, and of course get a chance to take questions both from the online audience and from the floor here. All right. So Beth Fogerty is going to kick us off. So Beth, your organisation, Wellways, is involved in the Housing First Consortium. Can you tell us about what this consortium is trying to achieve, and why do you think it's important to develop a universal definition of housing first? Thanks, Beth.
Thank you, Jane. And I just want to first acknowledge the traditional owners and the lands in which we're meeting, pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and anyone with us here today. And as we're talking about housing first, I also want to acknowledge the lived experience of homelessness and why we're doing the work that we're doing. So why do we want an international consortium around housing first? Housing First, as Jane said, has gained momentum over the past few years as a way to end homelessness, particularly with the added element of support. The focus here has been around many programs worldwide that have had various Housing First programs. And this has meant that Housing First has different definitions, different meanings, but all around that same common theme of housing without any preconceived notions, and then being able to provide support and housing for individuals. Do I have a little button? There it is, sorry. Okay. So what happened is the international body of Housing First has really grown over the past few years. They had a few years ago the first international Housing First conference that was attended by about 100 or so delegates. What happened in that was really the start of a conversation in saying, what is housing first? Because what we're finding, as I said, depending on how funding's rolled out, depending on countries, we have these variations of a theme, variations on housing first. At the last International Housing First conference, which was held last year in October, the international community got together and said, we actually want to raise the profile of housing first, the need for fidelity, the need for a common practice, and to establish worldwide approaches and practices. And why would we want to do this? We want to do this to be able to further the evidence and the research of housing first, to then be able to better lobby our governments and our funders to fund housing first programs. Right now, the funding that we receive does not adequately provide for both the housing and support needs, and nor does it always have subsidies to support rents. So when we looked at this, we got a group together from around the world, and our Canadian partners were the instigators, having started the conference in October. And we've brought around people from around the world. We've got representation from Canada, from the America, from France, from Chile to support the South American nations, through the UK, Europe, and then Wellways Australia are the Australian representation within the International Committee. One of our objectives is to build a catalogue. We know Housing First has been out there, and we want to actually define where Housing First or what programs are defined as Housing First are around the world. So we've started to have conversations and build this catalogue. A list of these Housing First identified programs worldwide would then be used to really look at and go, how do these meet a standardized definition of Housing First? So when we look at that no preconceived notion around being able to be housed, support, subsidies, and really supporting people to live the life they want to live in their communities around choice, sustainability, it was to be able to, how do we then have a definition or a fidelity rating to be able to assess what these programs are. We want to do this to provide world-class training, research and evaluation to be able to continue to provide Housing First quality programs worldwide, that we all talk the same language. That enables us to really further our evidence and research base. With this, we also are providing a community of practice where we can build in fidelity, but also training and development for programs, countries, governments who are interested in Housing First. How can we build an advocacy platform to influence funders so that the real cost of Housing First, its implementation, its training to meet standards and practices are upheld? With this, fidelity plays a real crucial factor. There is currently a Housing First fidelity tool. Samson Barris started this, and it's been evaluated and researched. The Chez Soi study in Canada has used the fidelity rating tool, but it's not really well known, or the training around it. What we really want to promote is that this tested tool is used to better advocate and promote Housing First practice, and that programs who identify as being Housing First have a fidelity test. What this then does is it allows us to go, what programs are delivering Housing First against the principles and practices of Housing First? And then what are those programs that have elements of Housing First in them? They're both important, but it's about what we know that we're talking about to be able to influence and further Housing First across the globe. So why international? Again, this is about countries working together for a common goal. We know that Housing First is a gold standard program, but to do that, we all need to talk the same language. And I know I say that quite a few times, but this is what the International Committee is really about. How do we have reference points across the world for people to be able to have a conversation with, understand a bit more about Housing First, but also to be able to have that little bit of push or emphasis, a bit more research behind conversations with local government and agencies across the world. So that's kind of the focus of the International Committee. And, you know, really, it's a committee here to support each of you, not only in service delivery, but in how do we promote Housing First more broadly. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Beth. We're going to move straight into Michala McMahon now, who's going to talk about the experience of the United Kingdom in the non-negotiables and why they were developed.
Thanks, Jane. Oh, mine's changed for me. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today and pay my respects to anybody that's Indigenous that's here today or online, and to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also just like to note that I'm visiting from Perth and would like to show my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. So I'm going to echo some of the things that Beth just talked about when we talk about the non-negotiables for housing. So the non-negotiables were developed by Homeless Link in the UK, and they were to provide a clear kind of guide as what constitutes as the English high fidelity to the, I guess, the principles that they've got in England, which they believe will assist in delivering high fidelity and more successful housing first programs to support very vulnerable people. The non-negotiables of the housing first model in England are aimed at assisting with the planning and development of new housing first services and programs, and also to help existing housing first services to reflect on their practice, to make sure that they are still reaching high fidelity, or whether they've had some program to reflect on that. I guess a little bit like Australia, Housing First has become a bit of a buzzword, and the way in which Housing First services are planned and commissioned in the UK can shape the delivery and ultimately impact whether we are actually delivering long-term, effective housing first programs for the people that need them the most, and what they define as a housing first model. So they say that the principles are often open to interpretation, which they are here as well. And as you can see, we've got the 8 principles for Australia on the screen. In the UK, they only have 7 principles, and they would say that some of those principles are really difficult to measure whether they're doing the principle in practice. Generally, what they would say is that the principles are ways of working and in a housing first model, and the fidelity of the ways of working are often on a sliding scale of really high fidelity to low fidelity, like how many principles can you put in practice within your organisation to make sure that we are actually supporting people that need a housing first model the most. With some of the principles being harder to define in practice, they felt that some of the elements of housing first principles were actually quantifiable. So they wanted to be able to pull those out and find out whether are they actually there in programs or are they not? So they developed 5 non-negotiables. And I'm just going to go through them. So the first of those non-negotiables is housing first is for people experiencing multiple disadvantage. And why they say that is that research and evidence shows that high fidelity is more effective for those people than other support models that are in our support systems. And it also shows that there's really great cost effectiveness for them. I guess the people that experience multiple disadvantage often and sometimes can experience chronic homelessness, where they bounce from short-term accommodation, transitional accommodation, back to the streets, which shows that, you know, some of those programs are really ineffective for people that have got many complex issues that they're facing. And it really, you know, once they leave that accommodation, quite often the support is attached to accommodation. So it means that they lose that support every single time and quite often have to start from scratch again because their support doesn't follow them. The second non-negotiable that they have is a permanent offer of support. So trusting relationships and unconditional support, I guess, are key elements of recovery. And they shouldn't be time limited for a person that might need them for a long period of time. And their support needs may change in ebbs and flows. So they might need more support at the beginning, it might taper off, there might be a crisis situation, they might need some more support again. So their support doesn't end when they leave the accommodation or when they get housed. The third non-negotiable is non-conditional access to housing. So for people with multiple disadvantages, housing can seem like it's an unattainable goal in some cases. And the staircase approach to housing sometimes doesn't work for these people, and it shouldn't be, I guess, seen as a reward that you get a house once you've been through a program that sometimes has staircases or goals that you can't meet because of your disadvantage or because of your complexities. So having a home, I guess, what they would say in that is that having a home is where it provides a base for support, and other support needs can be addressed when somebody is feeling stable. The fourth non-negotiable is sustainability of tenure. Much like access to housing, people should be entitled to the same types of tenancies that you or I are entitled to. So not short-term leases, not licensed to occupies, an actual lease, a 12-month lease. What we see is that when people have short-term accommodation or they're on leases to occupy, is that they feel that maybe sometimes their housing can be taken away from them at any given time because they don't have the same tenancies of what we have, which results in them not feeling safe, not being stable, and then also not being able to address the things that they might want to work on, such as health issues, mental health issues, reconnecting with family, or drug and alcohol issues. And the last non-negotiable is small caseloads. So they would say in the UK that a non-negotiable for a Housing First programme at high fidelity is no more than 7 people. So staff can be responsive to people's needs, and the support can be tailored in a flexible and personalised way. That feels like such a luxury when we talk about having 7 people on a caseload in Australia. The non-negotiables have been well received, I guess, in the UK, and Turning Point in Scotland did recently have named a conference after them. It's called The Good, the Bad and the Non-Negotiables, where lots of people across the country kind of came together and talked about their experiences of Housing First and what they define as non-negotiable within their services. But as with the principles, there isn't really any accountability for them actually putting them into practice. So they're starting, or Homeless Link are starting to embark on the development of a fidelity assurance toolkit, which they're hoping to co-produce and co-design with the government. And we'll have 3 frameworks of fidelity. 1 framework from a funder's perspective, 1 framework from a commissioner perspective, and 1 framework for delivering partners, so people that are actually delivering services within a Housing First context. And that's me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michala. There's some interesting non-negotiables. I think we'll get some good conversation flowing from those. Cathy, Humphrey, do we have to wait for governments to increase social housing supply to do Housing First, or can we just get on with it?
Well, I can do a really brief answer to that, Jane. No. We don't need to get caught up in getting it perfect to get on with Housing First. And I want to give you 2 examples from the organisation that I lead, Sacred Heart Mission. And the first is our Journey to Social Inclusion program. Now, some of you in the room will be familiar with it. We've been working on this program for well over a decade now. But in the beginning, the journey started back in 2006. And that's because we asked the question about, were we getting outcomes for the community that we were supporting? And the best we were doing was managing their homelessness status. And can I say, decades on, I'm not sure some of that has changed. But what we did back then, we developed and designed a model called the Journey to Social Inclusion. We put a budget aside. We put the budget aside in that we weren't constrained by if funding was available or how much funding might be grouped around the service model. We developed a proof of concept, and it was fully funded by philanthropy. So government at that time wasn't prepared to invest in intensive services. But we knew we needed to develop an evidence base that would tell the story not just back then but into the future. So we went through a rigorous randomised control trial study that measured J2SI not only across the 3 years of service delivery, but also post-service delivery, because we wanted to evidence that the outcomes stuck, that people stayed out of homelessness. And surely that is the aim of Housing First. Now, back then, we didn't have a housing supply available. We used the system as it was. In Victoria, we have a housing register system in which people are prioritised onto a public housing waiting list. And also in Victoria, we have some well-equipped community housing providers. So we used our relationships with government and our relationships with community housing providers to shore up access to the stock. It was difficult in the pilot. Our aim was to work with a rapid housing approach, and that meant we were housing people within 6 months of service delivery. Now, 5 interventions or 5 cohorts down the track, as we are now delivering J2SI through a program, a payment by results model, we're housing people soon after engagement. For most, at most, it's 90 days of referral. We are getting closer and closer to housing first, and it's about using the system that is available, developing those strategic partnerships with community housing providers, developing a relationship with the department to access prioritised housing. It's having staff that know how to use the housing system to ensure housing access. Now, J2SI has a really clear theory of change. It's a program logic that is measured against 5 outcomes. We therefore know that it works. And we know after the first cohort has been through the social impact investment that 96% has sustained housing post-support. And I think that's an amazing outcome if I think about our challenges back in 2006. We've now delivered the program to 310 people, and these people are what I call the tip of homelessness. They are the most complex cohort that the service system sees. And what my challenge is in sharing that with you is you don't have to wait for government. You can innovate. For Sacred Heart Mission, we are very fortunate to have our own revenue generating activities, be it our op shops or our fundraising activities. And my challenge to you as a sector where you do have those revenue capabilities is invested in innovation. Don't wait for government to identify the funding source. The second one I want to talk about, many in the room, we are still funded for transitional specialist homelessness services. 13 weeks of support. I'm not sure what that does these days except manage someone in crisis. We've been challenged at Sacred Heart Mission while we've been working on J2SI to think about the rest of our homelessness responses. How do we make sure that homelessness is a brief and non-recurring experience? What we know of those that come through our engagement hubs in St Kilda is 50% of them arrive with housing in place, but it's at risk. And for that group, we do a great job of keeping them housed. But for those that arrive without housing, at the end of our support, only 11% were getting a housing outcome. We've got to change this. So we know we're waiting for reform, we're waiting for the national plan, we're waiting for a state plan. But while we're waiting, we want to get on with it. So again, we're looking to our donor support, to invest in a continuum of care approach that will allow us to flex up and down individualised support that is tailored with a housing strategy. And that housing strategy, again, relies on key partnerships with our community housing providers. We have to pull some levers to make the housing system work for us so that we can offer intensive tailored support alongside a housing solution. And already we're seeing people who've been in and out of homelessness secure permanent housing and get out of the service system. So my challenge and my answer is, yes, we can, and it's over to you now to find that innovation in your own territory.
Thanks, Cathy. I'm sure we'll have a few people respond to that challenge. Karyn, housing first means many things to different people. It's a philosophy and it's a program. What different contexts and systems have you observed housing first approach being taken both internationally and here in Australia?
I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to our Indigenous partners in Brisbane where we're on Jaguar and Turrbal land, and also just acknowledge the continuing impact of colonisation in why so many, over 30% of people in homeless services are Indigenous. I thought I'd just reflect first in answering this question on how we actually got here to be talking about housing first and how our systems have been evolving in the last 40 years, because really when I first started working in homeless services, we could get housing. So we were supporting people move from homelessness into cheap housing. It wasn't really good housing, but they got into housing. And then over the years, you know, the systems and the economy and our social and health systems have changed tremendously. I think that housing first is a foundation to the way that we build and plan housing, that we can't just keep building the one sort of kind of housing for everybody without really drilling down to, well, what is the need and design of the population group or the individuals that we're housing need, and randomly place people somewhere, because we know that that doesn't work, and it doesn't work for the individual, it doesn't work for the neighbourhood. It's also about how we assess and allocate housing and how our systems are orientated to have a end result of someone being housed and being supported if they need that support. And it's how we support and sustain a tenancy. But it's also about how does someone have a quality of life, that once they're in housing and on that journey from homelessness to housing, how do they actually have a quality of life in that process? I think that COVID gave us a fantastic opportunity to see the world a little bit differently, because we did see a homelessness response in a public health framework, and there are many things about homelessness that is about public health, and that is that homelessness is a threat to the individual or the family or the community, and that some of the lessons that we've watched over the course of COVID are actually really helping us to know what we need to do for the future. And, you know, the two main things were people's income was doubled, services were increased, and housing was provided. And maybe for the first time, we actually saw in practice that housing is a social determinant of health. I think that, you know, when we think about the SAP Act, for those who are old enough to remember the SAP Act, where, you know, when you read what the purpose of that legislation was, it was for people to become self-independent and self-reliant. And yet we know from our experience that so many people need interconnection. They can't just live in isolation and the way we see independence. But then after the SAP Act came all of the policies, the continued colonisation and impact. We began to learn from the Bringing Them Home report, the enormous trauma that was created with the removal of Indigenous children and away from family and culture. We had deinstitutionalisation of the orphanages, and children and young people became on the streets. We had deinstitution of mental health, disability, and the prevalence of domestic and family and sexual violence has gone up, as well as the intergenerational poverty and trauma and family disconnection. And, you know, we could go on and on about the inequity that poor people in Australia, whether they're homeless or not, have to healthcare, to jobs, to training and to education. And I think all these things have really impacted on us as specialist homeless services. And we have people with addictions, post-traumatic stress from adversity in their childhood and adults. And we keep, you know, children still aren't accessing early childcare education in the way mainstream are. We have, you know, kids being excluded from prep year because of homelessness. We have the removal of children into child protection systems because of homelessness. And I think that that's the context that we work in. So it's never been easy, and Housing First now is still not easy for the future. But I think that COVID really did give us a window into some of the different frames that we could look at it to maybe influence better outcomes, and to particularly go to what we are talking about today, which is a housing first response. But I think that to begin with, you've got to look at who are we responding to. And in a lot of the work, I don't know, I'm hopeless at IT. In the work that we've done over the last 15 years, particularly in learning about Housing First, is that it wasn't one model. It really did depend what was the context. And the first lessons we started to look at were that of the homeless service system, where the investment into crisis support needed to be really looked at so that you could get a balance, you know, the realisation that when we housed people, they weren't supported. So there was a benefit in staying homeless if you needed support, not necessarily a real benefit, but people did get services. But then when they got housed, they didn't. And in America, they did do a lot of, and so did England with their Rough Sleepers initiative. They had an amazing program called Supporting People, which was about, you know, probably 12 months or some longer, some were duration of need, where that's the notion of support not being something that was a quick fix and could bring people to just live their life and not acknowledge all these other factors, was beginning to be looked at in planning. And for specialist homeless service, it really was the realisation that you can't just keep funding crisis services for 13 weeks and move people around and people are homeless for 15 years, that we really have to look at how do we balance that system so that you can have investment into supporting people when they're housed and that you do the appropriate housing, because we can't just say, oh, they're housed in a boarding house that they don't want to be in because we've got a scarcity model of social housing or affordable housing. But what is the right kind of housing that we need for the people that we're, you know, trying to get that goal of housing and a quality of life and to remedy the trauma and poverty that they've been living in. So the planning aspect of it is one. I know some of the programs we saw in the beginning were called Shelter Plus, Housing First. The different names were sort of put around. And then Sam's model, which was really a brilliant idea of in the outsourcing of the mental health community health system, he matched ACT teams with housing vouchers so that people who were churning through their EDs of mental health could get access to housing with a voucher, and they had the ACT team providing that intensive support that you've heard about. And they also had some step-down models. And I think that the point I'm trying to make is that depending on the population group that we're working with, the support we provide is different. Like, we really have to, we really have to understand what are the outcomes we want for individuals and families. You know, we want their improved health and access to healthcare. We want in-home support. We want them to be able to self-manage that support when they get it. The healing and recovery through therapeutic services, that families and children can live together and be together, that their children aren't placed in a child protection system because of homelessness, and that people can sustain their tenancy obligations with support, and that they can resolve breaches and prevent eviction. And that's where I think is one of the big differences in our work, is that partnership that we need with housing providers and tenancy managers, so that you can educate and learn with people what are your obligations as a tenant. And often they are connected to the factors in their life that are creating that disruption to stability. So whether it mental illness, whether it is an addiction, or whether it is family disconnection and culture, these things are that could be strengths in their life, sometimes need that connection to reconnect people to those strengths. And for children and families, it's about school readiness, education, and post-school training. For, you know, other people, it's meaningful activity, or adults, they need to have some sense of community. What do they do with their day? And some can go and get work, but it's not one size fits all. And I think that's where the system needs to look at, how do you do it? Where the challenges come is who pays for it. And I think that some of the work that has been done overseas, I don't know, the circles aren't they? Oh, there you go. But the next one, is the policy and program components, which I think get oversimplified when we're just talking about sustaining a tenancy. We can have a housing first model that is outreach to people in the community, or we can embed healthcare and services in a well-designed building that is looking at the needs of the people that we want to be tenants in that building, and then that they are tenants, you know, that they are connected to community, that they're not left in isolation. You know, we need that community planning so that we can both orientate where people live and what choices they have about where they live. And we need the engagement of people when they are tenants so that they can give feedback, not only to engaging in the community, but also to, you know, even advocating for more social housing. That's one of the things that I saw really amazing in America, was when the community activism for people that got supportive housing was really, they just wanted to advocate so that more people got it. And of course, the access to mainstream services, like homelessness, is really created by policy failure. There are so many policies that over the years have changed. We put more people in prison. We do nothing when they come out. People can't get healthcare. The policies of how long people stay in hospital, even how long they stay in ED. Like I remember one of the government changed, they wanted 4-hour waiting list at ED. We used to get phone calls saying, can you pick me up? I've been here for 3 hours and 50 minutes. Like those policies really impact on people's experience of homelessness and being housed. You know, whether it is a scattered site where people are across the community and being supported by outreach, but the affordability is the critical thing. And we rely mainly on social housing. We don't have a big system like America does of private subsidies, and, you know, they have a higher rate of social housing in some European countries and in the UK. So they're the challenges that we've got to work out, is how do we actually give people more access to proper subsidised housing, knowing that it's in, you know, the supply is terrible. We're almost too late because of how bad the private market now is, and so many people selling for home ownership rather than rental. And we really need to work out the investment models for the support. And we've seen plenty of it over the years grow, like even aged care, where Wintringham's such a great example of how Wintringham has gathered how to get the housing and then how to use aged care funding and bring the two together, and you've got a really good aged care system. You know, mental health services and the people in mental health who know what to do with people with complex mental health care. They know the kind of service that is needed to be provided, but they can't access the housing. And it's a question of who pays, I think, and that's the challenge that we've got, and the opportunity, because I think COVID showed us that everyone has to pay. So that when you're talking about reduction in the health system, or having better systems of coming out of prison so there isn't recidivism, when you're talking about increased safety for women and children so they're not returning to violent partners, reunification so people aren't in the child protection, those systems need to start paying for that, because it's a better policy outcome. It's better for the individual and the family, and there is economic benefit to the taxpayer. It's just that we're such a siloed approach, everyone doesn't think that they really get any savings out of it. So I think there's great opportunities for us all, and getting down to, you know, what you were just talking about, Cathy, of what is that driver to getting the housing, and what you've got to do to get what's in the system is just as important as the supply of new housing. But I think the big message we would have for the supply is that it's not one size fits all. Supportive housing is a really good model, as well as the scattered site housing first specialist models, and every community will have a different configuration. So we need to have a housing first orientation to our community and services planning, as well as, you know, that orientation in specialist homeless services, that housing is the end goal. But we've got a long way to go before we get to that collaboration. But I think it's a fantastic opportunity for us to do it. But before I finish, I just would really love to acknowledge Cathy said this might be her last conference, because she's finishing 30 years at Sacred Heart Mission, and I think it would be really great if we could just acknowledge her wonderful contribution to homelessness services.
Okay, thank you, and well done, Karyn, for acknowledging Cathy's contribution. It's a very, very significant time, I think, certainly for us in the Victorian sector, and Cathy has had a very significant role in changing the landscape and in really getting people to think about how other sources of investment can come into social housing and into homelessness support. Okay, so we've got a few questions coming in online. So if people in the audience have any questions, can you flag? We've got people up, we've got a question up there. I'll do one online and then I'll come up to you whilst the microphone's coming your way. Yeah. And our first question is an interesting one, and I'm not sure whether or not either of you two from the international, or even you, Karyn, I guess, from an international perspective, why Finland is a world leader in Housing First. Why are they not involved in the consortium?
It's a really good question, Jane. Yeah, I think the consortium itself started out from a conference. And so it was everyone who was at the conference. We had a conversation and went, let's do this. But so we've met twice since then. And we're still in that stage where we're going, who else should be involved? And, I agree, extending that to Finland. So we recently just brought on our Chilean partners. And I'm very happy to take that back to my meeting next month. But yeah, I mean, it really is about having that international consortium and where there is good work and who are those leaders and being able to have those conversations to really bring people together.
We have a...
Hello, my name is Rob and I work at Bungaree Aboriginal Association as an SHS Specialist Homeless Service caseworker. My question is, maybe any one of you can answer, how do you define a rough sleeper under the Together Homes program? Because in the policy, it states one thing, but in organisations, they state a different thing. Department of Housing defines it as a different thing. And it's really hard to get a client into Together Home under the three different cohorts that you've got to put a definition on how long they've been homeless, where they've been homeless. Because if they're homeless sleeping out in the rough and you put them into TA, they are no longer rough sleeping, so therefore they don't qualify for Together Home package.
Is that which state? Is that
New South Wales?
Yeah, I had a feeling it was New South Wales, and
I mean, I can only speak to the Victorian experience, so we're not delivering the same programs as you are, but I think having that there needs to be some consistency in the definition. So I think you've got a challenge there from a policy environment, but also a service delivery environment. But we would see that if people who've had rough sleeping experience and now placed in transitional housing, they are not permanently housed. They are still experiencing the cycle of homelessness. So, for the Journey to Social Inclusion program, we use a definition that's both about rough sleeping, but also around that kind of temporary housing experience. Because I think both apply, that people don't have a permanent address, that don't have a permanent home. And so under the definition, from our perspective, being in transitional housing or crisis accommodation is not being housed. I don't think that helps your experience, but we're not from New South Wales, sorry.
But generally, I think we need to be just really careful about these labels of where people are at the point of time we meet them without understanding their history of homelessness. Because people do intermittently go into motels, they go into boarding houses, they go into crisis accommodation. But if you understand their history of homelessness, it's a much better way to be looking at how do we actually then seek a solution. But really tight eligibility doesn't really give us flexibility or adapting to what people need.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the beauty of having something like a by name list, where you can kind of look at somebody's history of housing and homelessness and whether they've been rough sleeping back onto the streets, whether they've been into a transitional accommodation for a short period of time, back out again, then into a crisis accommodation service. It gives us that information to be able to say, just because they're not rough sleeping now doesn't mean that they've not had a long history of being coming in and out of homelessness.
Another question, and probably going to go to you first, Michala, because you addressed it directly, and then I think both Cathy and Karyn might have something to say. How do we avoid cherry picking by using activity-based funding? And then this is an online question, has seen firsthand that often more challenging clients get bounced around in the too hard basket. You certainly spoke to the non-negotiables as being they've got to be very complex or, meet high need.
Yeah. And I think, I think there are some support services or some accommodation services that are not set up to support really vulnerable people with, experiencing multiple disadvantage, just because of their funding structure and the support that they have or they're able to provide on site. So, I'm not, I guess, saying that nobody cherry picks, because I think that we all know that that kind of happens sometimes. But I think that it's about being able to match those people that are really experiencing, long-term homelessness, multiple disadvantage, lots of complexities, with the right service at the right time and providing that wraparound support. There's no point sending somebody that, is not willing to or doesn't want to and doesn't see it as an issue, sending them to an accommodation service that is, that you can't use drugs or alcohol, you have to be sober to stay there, or there's a curfew around coming back at a certain point of time and you can't be under the influence. That's just setting somebody up to fail. And quite often we're left with, I guess, very minimal options around what is available, that we do send people to those services, but it's not helping anybody in the long run. It's not helping the person that's going to get there and turned away after they've travelled somewhere or they've spent some money to be able to get there. Or they go and spend a night and then they're back on the streets again, which, gives them false hope around having, a longer term accommodation. And it also sets the services up to fail because they're not, the staff there and the funding model are not able to be able to wrap around support services for that particular person, especially when they've got, up to 50 other people that they're looking after in that particular complex.
Anyone else?
Jane, look, what I think is that essentially you need a continuum of care response, which is individualised, tailored, and can flex up and down. And I think it should allow for people who have first-time homelessness, let's get them out quickly and help them not to return into homelessness. Equally, let's have a service system that really supports the pointy end. So I worry about the cherry picking. I love for it to go because I think we should be working with all people who've experienced homelessness, even if it's for the first time, and for those who've been cycling in and around the system for the long term. I think how you do it is make sure you're clear about the eligibility. And, goes back to that question of the woman from New South Wales. I think when you haven't got that clarity around eligibility and outcomes, I think that allows that fuzziness around the service system to remain. But if we can remove that and say we should have a flexible, tailored system that responds to a continuum need, then we shouldn't be having the cherry-picking conversation.
And I suppose to add to that is that services need to make the needs of people that are coming through. And in some instances, that's about what is the training and development we need to do for our workers and our services in thinking differently so that we do have that continuum of service that can be offered.
I think we also need to, what that continuum is, that not everyone who comes to homeless services needs intensive support. And basically, the common element is affordability. People can't afford to pay their rent. Their income isn't high enough to pay their rent. The rest is really working out who needs support to be linked back into mainstream services. And some people just need the affordability and they can do it themselves. Others need that support to reconnect with wherever they've got to go into a new community, for example. and others need the support in a more ongoing way. And I think that, you know, government and policymakers probably get scared off thinking everybody needs it, or that we only worked with 7 people at a time if some people didn't even need support in the first place. So how we actually work that out is what the work of each system needs to do, and that's having clarity about your different programs. Like if you've got a sustaining tenancy program or a rapid rehousing, like making homelessness rare and brief and non-reoccurring starts with people not being homeless for too long and preventing evictions. But we roll everything into the one kind of program, where in fact you need different skill sets and different programs for those sorts of situations. And we just don't have a breadth of them, I think. And then there's a tendency that everybody does the same thing when we should all be doing a continuum of things, because depending on what you're funded for and with what you've got. But you can't just, I don't think we should assume everybody is needing complex responses. Some people certainly do. And I know before COVID, we used to use the guide of 30% just needed affordable, 30% needed that helping hand to get back into a community or reconnect, and 30% were needing more ongoing support, like, you know, housing first models with intensive support or supportive housing. But now our data is showing us really clearly it's over 50, 60% who have multiple needs and require more intensive, regular, consistent support. I don't know why, but it's certainly much higher now than it was pre-COVID.
Just before we go to on this subject, I mean, I think so. You know, obviously there is a general agreement about that continuum of care and the variety of services that are needed. In bringing it back to Housing First and the fidelity of Housing First, you know, it was first kind of gained momentum and gained attention, if you like, as a program that really was aimed at ending rough sleeping. So in the conversation about continuum, is it a Housing First continuum, or is Housing First a step along that continuum?
Well, certainly in the States, it's a continuum. I think in England it was too. People were funded for different, before it became talking about as the more fidelity to a particular program or model. But there is equally other conversations going on about fidelity to other models, which was fidelity is really a program model, how you're going to work. But I think it's really been, how do we work out the mess? And where do you get the supply? We're so used to having to look at a scarcity model of housing and services, rather than a more, let's advocate and develop a more inclusionary and diverse housing and homelessness system.
I think our aim needs to move away from that stepped housing approach of graduating from crisis to transitional to permanent. We need to get people as quickly as we can into their permanent home, and that will keep people out of homelessness for good. If we can settle people into the home, sustain that tenancy, then we're doing our job well. But if we're only moving people through a stepped approach that they have to be housing ready, they're housing ready when they front up at your service, and we need to work hard to find that housing solution.
Mm-hmm. Just looking up, is there any...
I had a question over here.
Okay.
On your left. Oh, no, your right, my left.
Sorry.
So I really love the comment around staff development and building those skills. I've come from a intensive family support role into DCJ housing, and what I've noticed very much is that we sort of see the most vulnerable, homeless clients, but then it's how do we support the clients at that moment. So it's that continuum of, okay, we've got to understand what the need is. We've got to understand how to assess. So I guess my question was a little bit alongside the continuum, and how do we move from homelessness to tenancy to, that first, I guess the whole approach around the fidelity of supporting clients to be as resilient as possible and live their best lives. is there an assessment process or a model that you have that, that we can, I guess, quickly incorporate at the very beginning, because we know that the people that have experienced trauma, it takes a longer period of time to develop that trust, to unpack, I guess, where the complexities lie. How do we, at the very, very beginning stages where someone presents as homeless to us, how do we, is there an assessment model that you have as part of this program that we're able to then take on board?
I guess we don't have an assessment model. We have in WA, or parts of WA, we've been, and I guess parts of Australia, we've been using the VI SPDAT, which is the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritisation Decision Assistance Tool. I'm not going to say that again because it's very long-winded. But like I said, it's not an assessment tool, but it easily helps you understand what the person needs and what services they need right now. I think that we've got lots of people that are in case management positions, and not necessarily all case managers or support people are specialists in every single area. They're generalists. And we need, it's not going to take one organisation to end homelessness. It needs multiple, not just specialist homeless services, but specialist services to come round and be able to build the capacity of the homelessness sector, as well as us building the capacity of the other sectors that are out there as well, to understand a little bit more around, the trauma around homelessness. So I think that the VI SPDAT does give us a bit of a guide around what support services that person might need, whether they need intensive support, whether they need a Housing First programme, whether they need just some temporary accommodation or financial support. So I think that's a starting point for us, but I'm not sure what everybody else does.
I think from a workforce development perspective, I'd probably add that the homelessness service system generally kind of works really hard to get housing, and then they stop support. Job's done. And I think we need to move to a mindset that's about sustaining tenancies. So I think that practice approach around sustaining tenancies is a real gap in our workforce, and it's something that we've worked really hard to think about what that means across our services. That settlement work is really important. That sense of identity of going from homelessness to housed and then to a home is really critical. And it was really great to hear the lived experience session, because I think integrating peer support models has really helped us with our approach around the settlement and sustaining tenancies work. So from a practice perspective and a workforce perspective, I think that's really been a great addition that we've seen in our programs.
I think the idea of support with housing is really important. Wellways have a Joy program, and with that, because we work with mental health, we're really looking at the mental health outcomes and recovery and tenancy all through the same lens. So what are the things that are the individual working on, needing? We use trauma-informed support, and really going, well, individually, what does that person need for their home, but in their life? So again, a person is not just about their housing or about their experience. It's about what do they want in their life. And I think when we start looking at people as individuals with individual needs and have that as part of our assessment, as well as, what are those other things that they need, we actually start breaking down some of those traditional barriers as well.
If you work for a family intense, was it a family intense support program? I think some of those programs could really orientate themselves to fill out housing application forms with people, because sometimes what we get is people have disclosed so much to an existing support provider funded by another system, and then they get referred to a housing specialist service just to do the application form. I would encourage anyone who's funded under any program to not be scared of housing application forms. That they're really the fundamental start to being on a waiting list or to getting housing, but it just saves someone having to go through it necessarily in terms of all the other aspects of support that they need. And generally, housing is really happy to work with a support service regardless of where it's funded from, just knowing that if they are a family or an individual's placed in housing, they have support around them. And I think that disconnect that sometimes exists between you've got to go to a specialist homeless service to get the housing pathway, and people may need work to be trained on it, but generally speaking, getting that application form filled in is a really good first start. You might want to get some support from a specialist housing provider around how do you navigate the system, but working together rather than it just being a referral and one person dropping off, one team dropping off. I think we'd be able to serve more people better, and we do when we have that partnering approach, because when people just have to get referred and go through it all again, it's a lot of our time, and it's a lot of more trauma really for the person who's got to go through it all again.
I've got a question online. How much of self-determination is present in deciding housing when there is a huge issue of supply, especially for the Indigenous people and their specific requirements? Anyone want to have a go at that?
Look, I can't speak to the Indigenous experience specifically, but I guess what I could talk to is the approach that we take through the journey to social inclusion, which is allocations based. So when a property comes available either through public housing, through the Victorian Housing Register system, or through community housing programs, the property is not automatically allocated to an individual. We take a view of the person's circumstances and preferences, and we try to allocate a property that's going to match their circumstances. So we're trying to get a best fit that's both about property type and location. You know, we utilise dispersed stock, so it's not stock that's particularly located in the supported accommodation environment. And we've taken the same approach to our continuum care approach as well, where we're using an allocations group, which is, you know, a group formed within the organisation that looks at the stock that comes available and how that matches up to the individuals that are on that. Well, I kind of hate the waiting list, but you've got to have a list of people who are in need of housing. And so we're trying to best match the available stock at the time. And I think that's, you know, the best that we can do without having a significant supply to call upon.
I will just, I'll mention a couple of programs. So we used to have 50 Lives, 50 Homes and 20 Lives, 20 Homes is still it's just finished up in Perth, is that we used to get from 50 Lives, 50 Homes allocations that came to that particular movement program. And it wasn't necessarily a house that was attached or a place that was attached to a person. So the person had to be on, everybody that was attached to that program had to be on the wait list. But the housing allocation would come to the group, and around that table we would talk about actually what is this house? It's a single occupancy unit in this particular area with a garden close to a bus stop. And we would have collated that information, much like what we can do on the by name list now, but we used to have a spreadsheet where we would say, you know, these people, this is what they want. They need a garden for their dog. They want to be in this particular area, but they can't be in the neighbouring suburb because there's domestic violence there. And we would look at who on that list of people actually wanted that unit. And generally you can narrow it down to, you know, 3 or 4 people, and you'd be speaking to their lead workers, you know, whether it is the most appropriate housing choice for that particular person, and have conversations with those people. I think what we've got, and that works really well, I think within the 50 Lives, 50 Homes evaluation, we had people, we'd done a measure around people who were housed because their allocation came up and their name was on the wait list, and they were housed in the house that they were given the opportunity to have, and they had 3 days to decide. And then we looked at all of those people that were housed through the allocations that came to the collaborative group, and the collaborative group was much higher with their sustaining their tenancy over the house that was given because they're next up on the list. I mean, it just goes to show that, you know, that choice and self-determination around housing is, if you've got a best fit, it works better. The other thing that we've got at the moment is in a small community in Perth, in Bunbury, which is part of our southwest, is that there is a supportive landlord pilot project that's been funded down there, and that is directly housing people from the by name list. They don't necessarily need to be on the housing list, they don't necessarily need to be priority housed, But when a house becomes available, Housing Choices brings that house to the working group and talks to the people that are around that table, and of all the different organisations around, okay, we've got a 3-bedroom property, who's next, what's, what needs do they have, what support needs do they have, does it need to be close to a school, it's got a garden, it's in this area where that person's support networks might be, and it's easier for us to be able to work with those organisations and looking at a vulnerability list around who's the most appropriate person and whether that place would be successful or not, and then offering that choice and self-determination to that individual.
I think choice is really important. It's a principle of Housing First. And when we look at the Doorway program that Wellways runs, we sit down with individuals and we go, exactly as you're saying, Michala, what do you want in a home? What do you need? Who's going to come visit? Where do you want your children to go to school? Are you looking at family reunification? And then we take that information and support people to find homes in private rental. And one of the things that it also does is double check. We all might want to live somewhere, but is it realistic? And then what does that look like? So, we've got our choices, but then what is the ideal, and then what is that choice that we go, yes, this is one that I'm happy to live with. And so we're actually really teaching along the way and saying we can aspire towards something, but also where can we start that we're comfortable with, that provides us an opportunity for our health and our wellness and our connection to community.
Sir. Good afternoon, ladies. My question is, I come from an SHS service that's in New South Wales, and all our clients have been told they have to do all their applications for housing online. There's no paper form or anything. My question is, in the last 6 months, maybe longer, we've had a lot of clients referred to us that are already in a housing property, and they're going to get evicted because they're getting behind in their rent. My question is, why does it take so long for that client to be referred to us before it gets dire straight?
Well, they're the questions you need in a system to work out your protocols so that doesn't happen. Like, you need those referrals early. They're no good getting
Correct.
Late.
That's what I'm saying. We need them earlier.
And I think digital exclusion is a really big problem. Most of us, we know that, you've got to ring the week people have credit. They don't have it the next week. I don't think that's well understood by government systems. And sometimes, I think our workers bear the brunt of that. People think they just haven't done their job. They don't know how difficult it is to actually keep consistent communication over a fortnight. And I'm amazed that workers know when they've got credit and they don't, because they know the pattern, they know when they got paid. And I think it's really misunderstood. I mean, we don't have online applications, but even just phoning people to let them know that a house is available. And I think where people get penalised for that, it's a real problem, like that the timeframes are too short. But I think they're the type of Housing First protocols that every system needs to have about how to prevent evictions, how to keep in touch with people, how to recognise how difficult their life is in terms of communicating, and the systems we set up for communicating.
And look, I think the challenge is to the New South Wales government. I think that's where you're from, New South Wales. They need to be better, property managers. If they've got tenants that are at risk, how are they part of the service system that are responding to those at-risk tenancies? And so until they see themselves as part of the service system, you're going to continue to have that policy challenge and those delayed referrals that really, stop people falling out of housing, because ultimately it's more costly to have them fall out of housing than deal with the rent arrears. So it's a bit about the state government opening their eyes and having those conversations with the sector and working with you to make those changes there. And we've certainly seen it in Victoria with better early interventions when public housing tenancy is at risk, and really getting those tenancies sustained is really critical. So perhaps it's taking the challenge back to government, I think, in that instance.
I think it's also working cross systems, not just homelessness sector. What are the other supports? So keep going back to Housing First is more than just finding a home. It is about that support aspect. And so we've got, tenancy, but it's also about support. And I'm talking support for individuals beyond around how do I maintain my home, what's my tenancy requirements, how to maintain my rent, but how do I stay well? So we need to bring health and well-being supports into the conversation and into supporting ending homelessness as well.
I would agree. I think that, we do often see referrals coming in far too late. And I think, again, going back to the comment around building the capacity of the sector, not just homelessness sector, but housing as well, or Department of Communities, is that sometimes, there might be a breach in tenancy, and then, maybe they've tried to contact them, but they've not been available. They've sent a letter out, the person's illiterate and can't read, and doesn't check their mailbox anyway, or they've sent a text and they don't have that phone number anymore, and then it waits, and then the second breach happens, and then it gets to the point where, they've tried to make contact. I'd say tried loosely, is that we need to be more flexible around making sure that if somebody's getting their first breach around their accommodation, that we do everything in our power to go out and see that person face to face, to make sure that they have got the support needs that they need before it gets to the point where they're actually close to eviction and they've not had any support. And to turn it around in a small time frame is sometimes not possible. And we've lost an opportunity.
Talking about systems, and we have a question from the floor, I think. How can we get the NDIA to better tackle the complex needs of accessing the NDIS, particularly for people sleeping rough? Karyn, I'm going to go to you first, because you made some very nice observations about Wintringham and the success that we've had in leveraging aged care. I'm not sure that the sector's had the same sort of success for more broadly with the NDIS.
No, well, the funding model's not going to help get in early when something's happening, if someone hasn't articulated it. I mean, I do think workforce issues in NDIS are a challenge. I know when we had block funding for disability, we worked with the same cohort, like people who were in and out of homelessness over many years, and worked very well to get them sustaining their tenancy over 5 or 6 years. Some of those people have done well because they got in, but they'd had all that support previously. I don't think it's the case now for people that have never had much support. But we just got funded from the PHN for a program of Home and Healthy, where it's embedded in the homeless system to try and improve access and assessments. But there's many people who don't want to go through the assessments. They don't see it's a deficit model in a way, and people have fought hard not to be seen that way. And people with histories of sexual trauma and, from childhood into adulthood, they don't want to go through a list of questions or assessments that they've got to go through. So I think they should block fund more. And I think that the process of, the skill that we need in specialist homeless services is when we can, and if we've got capacity, be able to link with the, the care groups and the NDA assessments. But we're finding we just have to keep finding more and more money to pay for the assessments and to get the history. Sometimes the process, if you're doing it slowly and respectfully, people do reconnect with their history a bit, but it's not really great, and I don't think we're going to solve. I mean, the other thing is NDIS wasn't set up to meet the needs of everybody. Mainstream state-based services were meant to continue, but they haven't. And, things like social connections and community connections, nursing care, some of those things that were in place were very good models and were working, but they got cashed out, or, the money for those programs went into NDIS, and now those programs don't exist. So there's this need to reinvent the wheel again. And, you know, I think Victoria had all those hack nurses, and like the models are all there. It's just the funding mechanisms, and the individualised model of NDS is fantastic for the people that it works for. But there's a group of people and a service model that just doesn't, it's just not efficient. Like you can't train people up, you can't be consistent, you can't have that persistent outreach. You can't be, you know, it's really hard to have reliability when you don't know if it's a casualised workforce. We saw during COVID in the placement of people in hotels, their support network just disappeared, or their worker network disappeared. Not necessarily their support, but they had plenty of support from each other. But and specialist homeless services had to step in, and I think that has created a lot more fragmentation for people who could be eligible but don't want to access it, and people who would benefit greatly. We've had a couple of rough sleepers who have excellent NDIS providers. Like they've got in and they get X number of hours of support, and those workers are really committed to going wherever they are to meet them, be consistent, show them maybe something they've not done for a while, like go to a movie, do something different. And gradually people have then thought about, well, maybe housing is something I will be interested in, because their experience of previous housing is so bad that I say they don't want to go back. But it's only because of an experience that was so negative. It's not that they don't want a home.
Was there another one? Is anyone waiting for a question? If not, there's a few questions down here, but I'm just conscious. No?
This one up.
Hello.
There's a lady at the back of the...
Hi, it's Tanya Armstrong, Launch Housing. I'm interested in your thoughts on the use of head leasing for the complex cohort. We've had to use it out of necessity, but in Victoria in particular, where we've got what looks like a pipeline of housing coming, do you think there's any benefit in still having head leasing or properties in the private market as part of what we use in our sector?
Yeah, look, Tanya, we've certainly used it as part of our Journey to Social Inclusion program. When we were, you know, creating the implementation agreement with government around the social impact investment, we were really clear that supply wasn't available. So when we had a social impact investment and 50% of your funding's at risk because you don't deliver outcomes, you want to make sure you've got a housing supply solution there. So we gained agreement where we needed that interim supply until permanent housing became available. And so I think it had a real beneficial arrangement, and continues to through the program as we've developed and provided additional cohorts through the program. But it needs to have guaranteed supply at the end. So you can't just say, oh, we've fixed it, we've got head leasing stock for 2 or 3 years. What happens post that head lease arrangement needs to be part of the housing strategy as well. So I think it's good to have in the mix, but it isn't the solution in of itself. Yeah.
I've got a question online. Care to hear thoughts on housing first for youth from the panel. Not sure if forever home thinking is suitable for young people that are only just starting out exploring their life, hopes and dreams for the future. While preventative work is paramount, the reality on the ground is young people do experience homelessness, seen or unseen.
The FOIA model would be a housing first model, I guess. It's looking at subsidy, it's looking at support. So I think that youth are no different from everybody, and a forever home concept isn't necessarily what we mean when we say permanent supportive housing. If people make choices where they want to go and live somewhere else, or their life circumstances change, what you want is that people aren't moved on because of a program or an eligibility criteria, which is, you know, what head leasing is, that at the end of 2 years you've got to go, or whatever the time frame is. But I think there are models of people, youth services doing great work with support, whether it's in social housing, private housing or FOIAs. and every community is different because the needs of a community, of young people in the community are different. But again, the pathway of where did they go, when, you know, where do they want to live when they're past the age eligibility, just has to be part of the program, so that you're not ending anything and someone suddenly facing homelessness. Like, all that effort and work and all that sort of stability that the person may have come to experience just dissipates. You want to get the pathway planning sort of worked out if there is an age criteria on how long they can stay. But I think there's some examples of having young people in social housing or community housing where, you know, they can actually stay in the tenancy and another tenancy is provided for the support for a young person. I think that same, you know, being able to take over the tenancy in their own right as an adult is a great way to sort of get that pathway if they want to stay there, or hopefully they've learnt the skills and can choose somewhere else, but they're going to need support getting the pathway.
Yeah, I think I would just comment on that because I know that that's from a WA question. So we do have fire, but I think that there are a number of young people that have, you know, multiple complexities that wouldn't necessarily meet the criteria of being able to access fire. And we have, you know, limited other accommodation services for young people, apart from a few kind of temporary transitional accommodation services. So I think for WA especially, when our government invested in Housing First, they heavily invested in Housing First for adults. And as much as, you know, the principles are applicable for everybody, it's around, you know, I guess, really having something that's a bit more youth focused to support young people with the youth code of ethics, and being, you know, having employed youth workers working in a Housing First kind of response team, and providing or being able to provide wraparound support services. I think we have an issue in WA where a lot of our young or youth services aren't necessarily funded, homeless youth services aren't necessarily funded by the government, and we've got a lot of philanthropic funding, but, you know, there just needs to be, I think, a bit more of an investment in that. And we've started having those conversations at a youth roundtable, and we had Ashley Barnes-Cock from Away Home Project in Washington State talked to WA on Friday just around some of the other initiatives that they've got going on in Washington State around having a diversion fund to be able to be creative and keeping people in, you know, alternative housing or exploring kind of housing with young people that they might not have thought about before, and being a little bit more creative in the way that they can fund that with the diversion fund.
I think it's really important. Homelessness doesn't discriminate by age. So we've got adults, and yes, a lot of our focus has been around adult Housing First programs. It doesn't mean it won't work for youth, but what we need to do is look at what the support is for our youth, and that it's tailored to their developmental needs, but also what are those pathways for them into adulthood, and, you know, where they want to be. And so that we have systems that are tailored to individuals.
Very conscious that we have a couple of minutes left, and the virtual will cut off online. Are we still? Is it a quick question?
I'm Peter Anderson from Althea Projects. I'm in North Queensland, and we work really hard to wrap supports around rough sleepers and get them into accommodation. But we're finding once they get in that they just totally disengage with all the services and all the supports we've got in place. So I'm just sort of wondering what type of things you have in place to try to keep that ongoing support, because we're finding once we've got someone in a house, they're like, I've got my house, I don't need anything, and their tenancy goes downhill quite quickly.
Yeah, I think the social inclusion activities is really important. So, and that it's around engagement, around goals and aspirations, that, you know, getting a house and being settled in housing is one thing, but what else do they want from, you know, living their best life, however you want to describe it. So if you can get that engagement into them thinking beyond, I'm housed now, go away, you know, there's opportunities. So it's about how you connect them to community, reconnect to family, pathways to employment, pathways to training, pathways to education. So it's about that kind of holistic service offering beyond just this notion of housing. So I think it's also persistence is really important, that sense of not giving up, of sticking with them and continuing to find ways with, to engage and connect people.
Yeah,
I think healthcare has been a great way for us to keep that engagement up, because, I think it's not only the building that people live in, that it's well designed and suited to their needs, but people need to have a sense of safety in their body, in their mind, their spirit, their cultural connections, and they need to be connected to a community, whether that's their neighbourhood or it's a community of their own choice. But that has to be built into your program design. Sometimes I think case management is the only thing that our programs focus on, whereas we all need to have the flexibility to really be able to do those elements of the house itself and its obligations, healthcare, people's safety, and the community that they want to be a part of, which may be the neighbourhood or it might be something completely different.
Okay, well, thank you all. Please join me again in thanking each of our 4 panel speakers. It is now afternoon tea time. Just a reminder that there will be a survey around this session. We would welcome your feedback, and please feel free for anybody to come and grab one of our speakers to further the conversation. There is clearly a long way to go, but I think it's clearly been some terrific work done. Thanks all very much.